welcome to Storytime with Sugar. Today we're reading Baby for Sale. It was the last straw. Peter had never made a fuss about his baby sister drilling on his toys or ripping his books. For over a year he had put up with her awful smells and very loud yells and the terrible messes she made with her food. He hadn't even complained when she learned to walk and started following him everywhere. But now she had taken his brand new baseball cap and thrown it in the toilet. There was only one thing to do. Peter lifted Emily into his wagon and started off down the block. "Baby for sale," he shouted. "Baby for sale." Before long, he came upon Mrs. LaPlante working in her garden. "Would you like to buy a baby?" Peter asked. Mrs. LaPlante sat back on her heels. "Now, why would I want a baby?" she asked. "Her skin is soft like a rose," he said, stroking Emily's cheek with his finger, "and her mouth is ouch." Mrs. LaPlante laughed. "I have all the roses I need, thank you," she said, "and mine don't bite." Peter pulled his finger out of Emily's mouth. "No," he shouted, shaking his finger at her from a safe distance. Emily shook her finger back at him. "You're not cute," said Peter, and off he went once more, shouting, "Baby for sale, baby for sale." Next he came upon Mr. Diaz's antique shop. Mr. Diaz was setting up a display on the sidewalk. "Would you like to buy a baby?" Peter asked. Mr. Diaz straightened up and looked at Emily. "Why would a bachelor like me want a baby?" he asked. Peter thought again. "When you tickle her tummy, she makes a happy sound," he said. Crash, bang, plickety plunk. "Oh no," cried Peter. Emily had grabbed Mr. Diaz's tablecloth. Antiques were flying everywhere. Peter snatched Emily out of the way of a toppling lamp. Mr. Diaz scowled. "That is not my idea of a happy sound," he said. "Please, take that baby away from here." Emily put Mr. Diaz's tablecloth over her head. "Peekaboo," she said. Peter rolled his eyes. Next, Peter came to Mrs. Stengel's convenience store. He pushed the door open. "Would you like to buy a baby?" he called. Out came Mrs. Stengel. "A baby," she said. "What would I do with a baby?" "You can talk to her," said Peter, "and she'll talk back." He knelt beside Emily. "Say, Peter," he told her. "Poopy," said Emily, tugging on her diaper. "Oh, no," said Peter. Mrs. Stengel laughed. "Lucky for you, I'm running a sale on diapers," she said. "P.U.," said Peter as he helped Mrs. Stengel change Emily. "She's still for sale," he said hopefully when they were done. "Sorry," said Mrs. Stengel. "When I want someone to talk to, I think I'll just call a friend." "No more pooping," said Peter as he put Emily back in the wagon. Emily grinned. "No more poopy," she repeated. Peter tried hard not to laugh. "Cut it out," he said. Off he went, pulling the wagon once more. Soon he came upon a street musician. "Baby for sale," said Peter. "Would you like to buy a baby?" The musician made up a little song and sang it for Emily. "Pretty little baby blue, what in the world would I do with you?" "You could sing for her," said Peter, "and she would clap." He bent down and clapped his hands in front of Emily. "Clap hands," he said. Emily grabbed his nose. "Stop that," cried Peter. The musician laughed. "I think I'll just let the people on the street clap for me," he said. "Emily," said Peter, rubbing his nose, "that hurts." Emily giggled and clapped her hands. Peter sighed and shook his head. By the time Peter got to the end of the block, Emily was getting cranky. Mrs. Chang was sitting in one of the rocking chairs on the front porch of the Rose Arbor Inn. Peter pulled the wagon up her front walk. He carried Emily onto the porch and sat down in an empty chair next to Mrs. Chang. "Would you like to buy a baby?" he asked. "Now, what in the world would an old woman like me do with a baby?" said Mrs. Chang. "You could rock her like this," said Peter, rocking the struggling baby back and forth, "and she'd fall asleep in your lap." Emily kicked and squirmed until Peter had to let her down. She toddled off after Mrs. Chang's cat. Mrs. Chang laughed. "My cat falls asleep in my lap," she said. "I really don't need a baby." "Are you sure?" said Peter. "She can do lots of cute things. She can walk and talk and clap her hands." "Sorry," said Mrs. Chang. Peter sighed. "Nobody needs a baby," he said. "Maybe not," said Mrs. Chang, "but I'd say that baby needs you. Look." "Oh, no," cried Peter. Emily had climbed down the steps and was toddling along the walk toward the street, and a car was coming. "Emily," Peter shouted, but Emily didn't stop. She just giggled and kept right on going. Peter jumped down the stairs and raced after her. Emily giggled louder and toddled faster. Peter reached her just as she was about to step off the curb. He grabbed her up and held her tight as the car zoomed by. Peter's heart banged like a drum. Emily kicked and fussed, but Peter just held her and held her. Mrs. Chang came down the walk, pulling the wagon. Peter sat Emily down in it. "Don't you ever run away like that again," he told her, and then he kissed her on the cheek. Emily puckered her lips and made a little kissing sound in return. Peter smiled. "You know what else Emily can do?" Peter said to Mrs. Chang. "What?" asked Mrs. Chang. "She can wave goodbye," said Peter. "Wave goodbye, Emily." Emily opened and closed her little fist. "Bye-bye," she said, as Peter turned the wagons toward home.